So, what is the science of human thriving?
When I was studying psychology, I would ask, like, what's the area of psychology you study for how you perform well at work and thrive in work? I started pouring through the research, but the research, what it really comes down to is,
Mhm.
so if you go from someone who's really stressed to someone who's in a positive frame of mind, there's a huge difference just in cognitive capacity.
You're talking about this dopamine cycles, and is that kind of the same as like when people go and work out and then they get that high?
What dopamine is about doing something worthwhile. Those neurons that led to doing that are going to be trimmed away. You don't want to be better and better at something that's wrong, right? You want to be better and better at something that works.
Like right now, right? What we're hearing about and some of the trends that we're seeing like massive layoffs, quiet quitting, a huge disengagement. These records are just like off the chart. What is happening right now with this, and how does the science fit into all of that?
Gallup, for example, estimate that this low engagement and disengagement and quiet quitting at work is costing the global economy something under $9 trillion a year.
How do we change that? Hi, everyone. This is the enThriven podcast. We're your hosts, Duncan and Kin.
Yep. So in this podcast, what we're going to do is discuss simple techniques and simple practices based on neuroscience and psychology to create thriving workplaces for people.
Just a disclaimer, we're not neuroscientists, we're managers who come with our experience from our own corporate lives. And we've both experienced burnout and a lot of challenges at our workplaces in the past. And from when I first encountered and talked to Duncan about a lot of this research, I was just blown away that there were so many things out there, this research that was never really taught to us. And so it's our hope that all of this research can be made known to more leaders and managers out there so that it can be beneficial for them to create better teams and workplaces for themselves. So, what is the science of human thriving?
So it's interesting. You have to look in various different places. You would think that there's one area in psychology, for example, that is about how you thrive in being productive in the world, right? And when I first became a manager, there was as is normal, I think, pretty much no training on how to manage people. So I realized I was working with people, so I need to understand psychology. So I started studying psychology and pouring through the research. And at every module, when I was studying psychology, I would ask, like, what's the area of psychology you study for how you perform well at work and thrive in work? And there isn't one, right? There's bits and pieces scattered all over. There's some in organizational psychology, some in strengths-based psychology, some in positive psychology. Probably strengths-based psychology is the main the main area. So I started pouring through the research, but the research, what it really comes down to is, to be productive, we have to be in a positive frame of mind. And the things that we do when we're learning and when we're accomplishing something, when we're doing something productive in the world, it produces neurochemicals like dopamine, acetylcholine, and those feel great, right? So people need a safe environment. They need a relaxed environment. When people are in a positive frame of mind, there's some research out there that suggests that our brains work up to 30% more effectively when we're in a positive state of mind. And when we're stressed, works even less effectively, right? So if you go from someone who's really stressed to someone who's in a positive frame of mind, there's a huge difference just in cognitive capacity. And almost all of our jobs today are knowledge worker jobs.
So you're talking about this dopamine cycles, and is that kind of the same as like when people go and work out and then they get that high? So we're saying like we can get that kind of thing, but like through work. Is that what you're saying?
That's what dopamine is actually meant for, is being productive in the world. So if you work out, if you're doing an exercise that you enjoy doing, you get a dopamine spike, right? And that dopamine spike feels great. It feels like fun. And when you get a dopamine spike, you also get an adrenaline spike, because adrenaline is made from dopamine. But really what dopamine is about doing something worthwhile, like achieving something worthwhile, being on the right path. So dopamine is a neurochemical that keeps us on the right path. And when we think about being productive in the world, that's really what thinking about, right? It's doing something worthwhile, accomplishing something. And dopamine is the main neurochemical with that. And dopamine is something that we'll get that when we feel we did, yes, that was right,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which goes completely against what so much sort of common practice management ideas are, right? That to get people to grow, you point out what they're doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, when we point out what we're doing wrong, when people get the message you shouldn't have done that, those neurons that led to doing that are going to be withered and trimmed away. You don't want to be better and better at something that's wrong, right? You want to be better and better at something that works. So you can imagine in ancient times, people go out hunting and they'll try a few things that don't work and they don't come home with any food. You don't want those things to be reinforced, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when they do something and it works and they get the animal and they bring it home, you want whatever they did to do that,
Mm-hmm.
you want that to be strengthened. And so that's what dopamine does. That dopamine spike, it feels great, so we want to do it again. But what it does is it also strengthens the neurons that led to that dopamine spike,
Mm-hmm.
so that we do it better and better in the future.
Like right now, right? What we're hearing about and some of the trends that we're seeing like massive layoffs, quiet
Yeah.
quitting, a huge disengagement, a record number of extended medical leave from all of this.
Yeah.
These records are just like off the chart. And my own experience is that at work, I feel like often I see in the past, like sort of these band-aid solutions that
Yeah.
companies give you. They try, we had what was it called? EAP,
Yeah.
employee assistance programs, where you get these counseling, the meditation, breathing programs, once in a while. But all of these, it just feels like they're just sort of, the stress comes from the work and they're just sort of solving these things on the side.
Yeah.
What is happening right now with this, and how does the science fit into all of that?
Gallup, for example, estimate that uh, this low engagement and disengagement and quiet quitting at work is costing the global economy something it's just under $9 trillion a year, which is an insane amount of money. There's also evidence to show that there's quiet quitting, or what they call presenteeism. So people don't feel like coming to work, but they're coming to work because they have to. Costs companies more than absenteeism from stress at work. When there's mass layoffs and things are uncertain, people's stress goes up because uncertainty makes us stressed. It makes us anxious. That stress, of course, it raises cortisol, neurochemicals like cortisol in our systems, which is very bad for our health. It drains us of energy, but what it also activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight response, right? Fight, flight, or freeze, getting ready for danger. And that quite literally shuts down our prefrontal cortex so that we are less able to think. That's why people who are stressed, their cognitive faculties, their brain works so much less effectively than people who are relaxed or in a positive state of mind. So I think it's something like half people are very stressed every day. I think in Ireland it's something like 70%, or it's 70 something percent of people feel burnout some of the time or most of the time. If you're looking at people who are of a younger working generation, it's even worse. So almost 3/4 of people are so stressed that they battle to function at work, right? And we're in knowledge worker economies. This is costing companies an enormous amount of money. And then you add this new trend that there is, especially among large corporates, to lay off swaths of people, not because the company is in trouble, but just because they can make more money that year, right? Companies are posting record profits and then also doing these mass layoffs. And you get this very short-term gain, but what it's going to do long-term to the culture and to how people feel in that company is going to cost them a lot of money.
Yeah, you told me once you actually told me that this was quantified once. What was the cost to companies of disengagement in general?
It's just under $9 trillion a
9
year.
trillion.
$9 trillion a year, which is you could feed every hungry person on the planet for that amount of money, right?
And how does disengagement, or how does this, 9 trillion happen? Like, how does disengagement specifically like cost a company?
So people are just far less productive, right? So, one thing it costs in terms of increased sick leave, increased work accidents, that sort of thing. But people are also just far less productive when they are stressed, right?
Hmm.
It's the difference between a person who's thriving, coming to work with energy and they look forward to what they're doing, and someone who's coming to work and they're just battling to get through the day and they have no energy at the end of the day. The difference in what they produce, and not it's not just the amount of work that they produce, but the quality of the work, the innovation that comes out of it. It's a massive difference, and that's what costs companies an enormous amount of money.
Hmm. I remember, I think I was talking to somebody recently, just a small anecdote, that what he found was there was a difference between, when he had employees, and what they found, being in an industry where they had to solve really big problems, is you could either have employees where you tell them exactly what to do, but they weren't proactive in looking for
Yeah,
for problems, and therefore they couldn't get ahead of those things and actually innovate. And then when they found that they were able to do a couple of leadership training tests, I'm not quite sure what it was, but just like a little bit of investment in the employees, and they started to see that the difference between having proactive employees is the same
yeah,
people, and same time, same all of that, but when you start having people who are proactive about looking for solutions and looking for problems and fixing them, rather than always having to be, the leadership that has to identify the problems and
yeah,
then kind of filter it down and tell people what to do. So I think in that way as well, like it's a very short term view by a lot of companies. But like we've talked about the bad news of like
yeah.
where we are today. How do we change that? Like, what would you say? I mean, this whole situation seems really big, and most people listening would say, like, I'm this little tiny cog in
Yeah.
this. How am I supposed to change like a corporate culture?
So changing the corporate culture is probably something that will happen over time,
Mhm.
but we can change our local environment quite quickly. And this was something when I was diving into research papers on human thriving and performance. There's one theme that comes up over and over and over again in these papers is that we know what the science is. We know how people thrive. We know what to do to get people to thrive. But business is not paying any attention to it. And they're
Mhm.
scratching their heads. Why is business not paying attention? I think Jim Clifton said something along the lines. So Jim Clifton was CEO of Gallup, and they probably the organization in the world that does more research on engagement and productivity in work than anyone else, and have for many, many decades.
Mhm.
And he said something along the lines of the science of human performance is well known, and it has been for decades. But the problem is the practice of management hasn't updated in all of that time.
Mhm.
Um, and he says something along the lines of there is no evidence anywhere in the study of human performance management systems in work that any of them do any good at all,
Mhm.
right? That any of the practices we do any good at all. Um, but I noticed there are other fields, not business, but other fields where they pay really close attention to the science, right?
Mhm.
Airline flight crews pay very close attention to the science. And a big part of learning to be a pilot is what they call CRM, crew resource management, which is just teamwork. And they pay very close attention to the science of how teams work well together, how people's brains function, what conditions they function under. And what really struck me is that there are things that are absolute taboo in an airline flight crew, like the pilot pointing out mistakes in everyone else type of thing, right? Which is
Mhm.
kind of standard management practice, right? Constructive criticism. That is so bad for teamwork that uh, it's crashed airliners all on its own, even when nothing else went wrong. Just that itself has crashed airplanes.
Mhm.
So the cost of failure there, of course, is very high. They pay really close attention to it. Top sports teams pay really close attention, right? You can't hide failure or fudge it or say it was somebody else's fault. You have to get to the bottom of it. So there are fields that pay really close attention to the science of how people function very well, and how teams function very well. But it doesn't seem to be catching on in business.
Hmm.
But when I was first promoted to be a manager, I'm not the sort of person at all that people want to follow or people want to be around, right?
Mhm.
So I was like, how am I going to manage this team? So I was just looking at the research and seeing, okay, people thrive in a safe, secure environment. Okay, so let me do these practical things to make that environment, and let me see. Or I was looking at collective intelligence, and there's really simple things you can do to get a team working together well with along the principles of collective intelligence. So I just did a few of those really simple things, and suddenly the energy in the team shot up, and the team was buzzing, and people, even senior leadership elsewhere in the company, were saying, "What's going on in that team? There's so much energy," and they were coming up with brilliant ideas, and the standard of the work shot through the roof. And it certainly wasn't coming from me, because I'm not that sort of person. It was just, the science says this is
Mhm.
how people work. Let's just do something really simple and put that into practice and see the results. And it's really not difficult. And I think this is really, for me, the biggest message of hope. So many people are managers, right? We're all either work for managers or we're managers ourselves.
Mm.
And so much of management training is about these traits you need to be a manager, or you need to be this type of person or that type of person. And apart from the trait of honesty and being trustworthy, I think it doesn't really matter so much what sort of person you are. It's if you just know the basics of how people thrive and do simple practical things, it
Mm.
makes a massive difference, right? People will run with it from there. They don't. It's great to have a charismatic leader, right? But
Mhm.
if you're not a charismatic leader, don't worry. There's simple things you can do that make a massive difference.
Mm. I think that's for me one of the things that you shared with me earlier that for me was really great news. Because a lot of times in companies, of course, we're trying to rate people on the scale. Like, if you're a really good manager or a top performer, you have to be like 10 on all these things.
Yeah,
And, you expect the top performers or managers to always be all rounders on all of these things, or you think like, oh, I can't be like that executive or that leader because I'm not charismatic, I'm not this, I'm not that. And of course, we tend to have a bias towards like charismatic,
mm,
extroverted leaders. But what the science is actually saying is you can be you,
yeah,
you can be whatever, you don't have to be a particular, come off a certain way or whatever. Everybody has their strengths. And if you use certain strategies, it's really just about how much of a leader how much you care about your team and pay
yeah,
attention to them and really just study each one of them. And that's what it really takes to be a great leader. It's not like an inherent characteristic or particular training that you need to get or getting the right framework or whatever
yeah,
that is. And I think that's great news for managers and
yeah,
leaders.
yeah, exactly. And apart from this trait of trustworthiness, right? People who don't trust their manager don't thrive in work. But apart from being trustworthy, so as long as you're not a jerk, right? Um, there are really simple things you can do. So I'll give you an example. When I first was put in charge of my first team, we had half a team, and I had hiring the other half, but we still had these features we had to develop. And the norm in the company at the time was that one developer, one programmer would do one thing for a quarter, and another one would do another thing for a quarter. Maybe there'll be some support between them, but that's how it worked. And so you'd get three or four things you had to do, and each developer would do one of them. But I was worried that if we did that, we wouldn't get any of them done. So I said to the team, okay, let's take the most important one, the highest priority one, and let's swarm all over it. So we broke it down into detailed tasks. We put them into 2-week sprints. 2-week sprints made sense for what we were doing. And then they picked up their own tasks, and they just swarmed all over it. And that was when the energy and enthusiasm and engagement in the team shot through the roof. Like, people were loving coming to work every day, and it was being noticed around the company. Like, my goodness, something's happening in that team. And as I said, it wasn't coming from me, right? I'm not that sort of person.
Mhm.
So then I was like, what's going on here? I need to figure out why that happened, because nothing in anything that we were prepared for management said anything like that, right? Just get people to swarm over stuff. And we did that for 2 quarters, and it carried on. It got better and better. And then another team decided they were going to do the same thing, and they had the same results. Their feature was a very big feature. They were expecting about 300 bugs to come out of QA. It was less than 30, and it was done in a fraction of the time. And the enthusiasm and the positive energy in the team also went up. So that's what led me on to collective intelligence. Maybe we'll get into collective intelligence later, but it's just a really simple thing that you can do that makes a massive difference. And it's not about the quality of the manager or the charisma of the manager.
Yeah. So I think we'll end this episode here. What our greatest hope is for you, our audience, is that you take some of these simple strategies that we've talked about and show you the research behind the neuroscience, the behavioral science, the psychology, to create simple strategies that you can take to work, whether you're a manager or a freelancer, or you just influence formal or informal teams. It doesn't matter. The research still holds. And we're really hoping that what this eventually creates is really healthy work environments where people go to work and they thrive. And that means that they're energized from work rather than drained. And what that means for us is that they go home, you are a better spouse, a better parent, and you have energy to do the things that you're passionate about. And overall, that creates healthier communities.
Yeah.
So that's our greatest hope from this podcast. All right. Thank you for tuning in. And we'll come back next week with something where we'll talk about the best practice myths and what the science really says.